The torches cast long shadows across a marble floor. A young woman walked barefoot toward a wooden figure in a corner of a dimly lit atrium. Her hands were shaking. Behind her stood 7 witnesses, faces lit by lamp oil, their expressions sober and neutral, their attention fixed on the single motion she was being made to perform. She had been told it was tradition, told it was necessary, and she had been taught the formulas by which her family would keep its honour. She had not been told the precise movement required, how her body would be handled, how the ritual would be recorded. She had not been told what it would mean for the rest of her life. Only now, when the cloth was removed and the carved object was revealed, did the reality arrive. A wooden phallic emblem, large and deliberate, set for a ceremonial act none of her teachers would describe in plain speech. She stood frozen until the pronuba gripped her hand with a force that suggested refusal would mean ruin. If you enjoy these dark histories, leave a like and subscribe. Comment below where you're listening from. I'm genuinely curious to know where these stories reach. The grip tightened. The pronuba whispered the required words. The witnesses shifted so their sightlines would be clear. A physician waited in the corner, instruments at his belt. Slaves held basins and clutched cloths. A man named Marcus Petronius Rufus, her husband that night, watched with a mixture of ritual composure and private tension. The moment had arrived. This opening is not invented for shock. It is reconstructed from a skein of legal texts, hostile Christian descriptions, embarrassed medical treatises, and the sparse practical language of Roman custom. What happened in that atrium combined law, religion, and the most intrusive kinds of verification, and it was routine in a world where the transfer of persons resembled the transfer of property. This is not a tale of mythic cruelty. It is a record of institutional practice and the ordinary mechanisms by which a society enforced them. The scene that begins our narrative collapses many things into one: the pronuba's authority, the priest's presence, the physician's instruments, the husband's role, the witness's silence. Names matter because they anchor the ritual in historical reality. Flavia Tertia, Marcus Petronius Rufus, the pronuba, the physician. These are not archetypes only. They stand in for countless real women and men whose lives intersected in legally mandated sequences. The ritual object had a name in sources: mutinus tutinus, a fertility emblem invoked at weddings. The Roman law that conditioned the ritual was explicit. Marriage was not merely a social contract, but a transfer of a woman's legal status. Writers such as Varro and later church fathers like St. Augustine and Lactantius leave scattered descriptions and condemnations that scholars must piece together. When we assemble the fragments, a consistent pattern appears: a private interior rite, performed in semi-public, designed to verify virginity and consummation, witnessed and recorded. It is tempting to reduce the ritual to a grotesque relic of the past, an oddity fit for moralizing. That would be a mistake. The practice performed a function in a society where inheritance and property lay at the centre of family life. The bride's body became the site where lineage was guaranteed. The institutional logic is cold. If heirs must be legitimate, the bride's sexual history is relevant. If contracts govern transfer, verification is required. The Roman apparatus designed procedures to convert private acts into public facts. Our task in this documentary is to follow that apparatus through its cultural, legal, and human consequences, and to keep the voices of those who were subjected to it, silent in their own records, sounding through the texts left by others. To understand the ritual, we must first understand the legal framework. Roman marriage came in forms, the most common being manus and sine manu. In manus marriage, a woman passed into her husband's legal authority. In sine manu, she remained legally in her father's control but joined a household by other ties. Both forms, however, intersected with expectations about chastity, legitimacy, and offspring. Legal writers, from the jurists of the Republic through the imperial codifications, insisted that marriage needed consummation to be complete. The phrase used in juristic texts, connubium consumari, meant that without sexual completion the transaction could be disputed. This was not an incidental clause. Property transfers in Rome required clarity. The sale of land, the transfer of cattle, the adoption of heirs, each step had witnesses and procedures. The bride's body was thus folded into the same legal grid. Sources are blunt. Gaius and later Justinianic compilations address questions of whether a marriage could be annulled if consummation had been prevented. They take for granted the idea that a woman's chastity prior to marriage was essential to the husband's property interest. From this legal vantage, the presence of a ritual to verify virginity and to ensure consummation is entirely logical. The moral language may shock modern readers, but the legal language is matter of fact. Roman jurists were not composing pornography. They were writing statutes and commentaries aimed at preventing disputes over inheritance. The fact that their procedures required invasive verification points to a society that normalized intrusions into women's bodies for legal certainty. The witnesses were essential because Roman law relied on testimony. Public acts required witnesses who could later be called upon in court. The pronuba performed a dual role: religious officiant and legal witness. Her presence turned a private space into a civic one. Ancient sources show that the pronuba's duties included more than ceremonial gestures. She was responsible for ensuring the marriage's formal requirements were met. That could mean supervising the ritual with mutinous tutinous, arranging for purification rites, and certifying that the customary words and acts had taken place. Church fathers, writing centuries later, replayed the scene in exasperated detail. Arnobius and Augustine used language meant to scandalize, but their descriptions, deliberately hostile, confirm the pronuba's presence and the sequence of events: a public display, washing, inspection, and the husband's entry. Medical texts dovetail with the legal and ecclesiastical fragments. Physicians and midwives wrote about examinations that sound clinical: inspection of the hymen, the use of probes, notes on bleeding. Taken together, these sources form overlapping testimonies that render the ritual less ambiguous than any single witness would suggest. In practice, then, the wedding night was an institutional performance. Religion sanctified an act whose legal consequences were of first importance. Language in the sources is careful and revealing. Varro mentions mutinous tutinous without dwelling on the physical details. That omission is important because it reflects an older Roman embarrassment about describing sex directly in polite prose. The Church Fathers, by contrast, were eager to name and shame. Augustine used terms that translate to mounting and intercourse when describing the ritual with the wooden emblem. Lactantius refused to detail it because the act was too shameful to commit to speech. Arnobius offers the most explicit early account. He describes brides seated upon the emblem while the husband looked on, framing the act as a deliberate humiliation. When medical writers like Soranus or the anonymous authors of midwifery handbooks record procedures to examine a bride's body, they do so with a clinical coldness that strips away rhetoric. Their texts include steps and instruments, observations about bleeding and anatomy, and instructions for recording results. Each genre, antiquarian, theological, medical, has its own bias. The challenge for historians is to read those biases in opposite directions. The Church Fathers tended to exaggerate for polemical effect, while jurists cleaned the practice into necessities that read like law. The medical writers, concerned with bodies rather than office, provide a counterbalance that tends to corroborate the basic sequence: ritual encounter, purification, examination, certification. The concrete detail in medical treatises shocks modern readers because it presumes consent matters only insofar as it affects legal outcomes. Instructions for examining a bride's hymen show concern with a physical sign rather than with a woman's comfort. Physicians described how to elicit bleeding and how to record results in ways that could later be called evidence. They advised midwives to note any scars or previous ruptures that might complicate a claim. The writings assume a forensic sensibility. A body is assessed as though it were a contested object in a courtroom. That sensibility informs the sequence in the atrium. The pronuba supervised the ritual with mutinous tutinous. Slaves washed and perfumed the bride. A physician performed an initial pre-wedding examination establishing a baseline. The ritual was enacted, and a post-ritual examination documented change. Witnesses, neighbours, relatives, sworn attendants were ready to testify. The objective was not to produce privacy or intimacy, but to produce verifiable facts. Once we abandon modern assumptions about privacy and bodily autonomy, the ritual appears less as an isolated cruelty, and more as the culmination of a social logic that prioritized lineage and legal certainty above personal experience. Flavia Tertia is our composite figure, distilled from the names and profiles that appear in sources. She lived in a world where betrothal contracts were carefully negotiated. Her father, like many paterfamilias, had calculated dowries, alliances, and property transfers that hinged on his daughter's reproductive capacity. Marcus Petronius Rufus appears in inscriptions as a grain merchant of moderate standing, typical of husbands chosen through family negotiation. The bride's age, often mid to late teens, and the husband's years older, are recurrent patterns in texts and epitaphs. The social script began months before the atrium scene: engagement negotiations, public ceremonies at the household shrine, a procession to a temple for auspices, and finally the transfer by legal formula. The public wedding, the conferatio for patricians, quemptio for some classes, or simple's consent, provided outward legitimacy. But the inward completion required the sequence that followed in private. Families trained their daughters in the expected behaviour: how to perform ritual words, how to bear the humiliation, how to manage the slave attendants who would scrub and dress them afterward. The goal was predictable. The bride should enter the husband's domus without scandal, and with witnesses who could prove her unspent status and the consummation that followed. The social pressures are brutal, but systematic. Daughters were taught that refusal would cause dishonour and legal ripples. If a bride resisted consummation, or arrived damaged in a way that complicated inheritance, the family risked a future damaged lineage. Women learned to navigate these decisions as a form of survival. Mothers whispered instructions: do not resist, obey the pronuba, accept the purification, submit to the physician. Those whispered teachings are visible in legal remedies that assume female passivity and male entitlement. Courts adjudicated disputes in which a husband accused his wife of prior immorality, or where a wife sought separation on the grounds of rape. The legal language was gendered and pragmatic. Women could sometimes secure divorce, reclaim dowries, or assert property rights, but these remedies required legal knowledge and access many brides did not possess. The system privileged male testimony and material evidence. This structural dynamic turns the wedding night ritual from an abstract consequence of social norms into a practical mechanism for enforcing them. We must examine the role of witnesses in more detail, because Roman law could not operate without them. Witnesses were not passive observers. They were institutional actors whose testimony converted private events into public facts. The pronuba's testimony could be decisive. She, the priest, the physician, and selected household members formed an evidentiary cohort. Their recollections could be recorded in a simple notation or later invoked in court if paternity or legitimacy were contested. The pronuba's testimony carried ritual and civic weight because she represented customary law as much as household authority. In case of dispute, a husband's claim that consummation occurred, corroborated by medical testimony and the pronuba's idle words, was difficult to overturn. The system raised a basin of power around women's bodies: the capacity to bear testimony, the authority to certify, the institutional weight of ritual scripting. A woman's silence, her lack of legal standing as an autonomous witness in her own case, made her vulnerability structural. The ritual used ritualized humiliation and medical scrutiny to produce the very evidence that would later lock her and her offspring into a legal framework. That framework functioned because witnesses were available and their words were admissible. This is not to suggest unanimity of practice across the empire. Customs varied by class, region, and period. Rural practice could be less formal. Urban elites followed stricter scripts. The pronuba's role could be ceremonial rather than forensic in certain contexts. In other settings, witnesses were more tightly controlled. Legal commentators show a variety of disputes that point to the ritual's variance. Some husbands attempted to rely solely on private knowledge or familial gossip. Others demanded formal certification. The patchwork of practices complicates any single narrative, but also explains why sources sometimes contradict each other. Church writers, focused on pagan decadence, projected uniformity that likely overstates the ritual's prevalence. Conversely, jurists, writing in the Register of Law, underplayed the ritual's social brutality. Still, the core element, verification of sexual status and consummation under witness, reappears wherever inheritance mattered. Even in provinces far from Rome, inscriptions and legal adjudications suggest shared concerns about lineage and evidence. The religious dimension mattered because Romans conceived of law and religion as intertwined. The pronuba invoked the household gods, the genius, and occasionally deities like Mutinus Tutinus, whose function was explicitly sexual and protective of procreative power. In popular religion, objects with obscene shapes functioned as apotropaic devices, warding off evil and securing fertility. Mutinous tutinous sits at the intersection of piety and practice, an emblem meant to summon fecundity and to mark a passage. For many participants, the emblem was not merely obscene but sacred. The pronuba's invocation transformed the act into a rite of passage rather than a clinical test. That religious framing mattered to families who believed divine sanction added legitimacy to a union. The rites on the wedding night promised not only legal proof but metaphysical endorsement. When Christian polemicists later described the emblem's use, they focused on its pagan obscenity. But Roman participants likely experienced a mix of religious expectancy and social pressure rather than cynical spectacle alone. The religious aspect also helped justify the ritual to participants who might otherwise balk. If a woman believed the gods themselves were invested in her fertility, the humiliation of a ritual might be framed as duty to the household and to posterity. That framing is visible in funeral inscriptions and household records where matronae are commended for their domestic virtues, including fertility and fidelity. Yet the religious rationale does not erase the human cost. A religious frame can legitimize what is otherwise coercive. The pronuba's perfunctory prayers do not relieve the bride's lack of agency. Ritual and religion therefore functioned as both justification and enforcement. This duality is central to Roman social technology. Institutions that link belief to legal outcomes create powerful incentives to comply. For historians, the task is to describe both the ritual's religious textures and the structural coercion they shielded. Consider the physician's role more closely. Roman medical practitioners wrote manuals describing how to examine the hymen and to interpret bleeding. These manuals read like forensic guides. They specify positions, the use of instruments, and criteria to determine prior sexual activity. The physician's testimony was valuable precisely because it seemed to supply neutral, scientific truth to a contested social fact. In the atrium, the physician performed two examinations, a pre-ritual baseline and a post-ritual verification. The first confirmed an intact state. The second recorded changes consistent with consummation. This double procedure mirrored legal logic. Establish a baseline, enact the event, then document difference. The physician's expertise converted ambiguous bodily states into binary legal facts. Medical authority thus buttressed social and familial claims. The presence of instruments and professional training did not equate humane care. Rather, medicine here served the law. The physician's pen could render a wife's body into evidence that confirmed or contradicted property claims. Physicians and midwives left technical details that highlight the dispassionate nature of the work. They described how bleeding could result from the rupture of the hymen, from other lesions, or even from the natural variability of tissue. These caveats did not alter the role of the procedure. They simply provided grounds for interpretation when disputes arose. In cases where bleeding was absent, jurists and physicians proposed explanations, delayed bleeding, anatomical variation, that could be used to defend the bride. The presence of technical ambiguity did not erase the ritual. It merely made medical testimony a contested field where experts influenced legal outcomes. The interplay between medical uncertainty and juridical need created space for manipulation, for coercion, and for the reinforcement of social hierarchies. The physician's role thus served as both arbiter and instrument of power. The absence of women's voices in the surviving texts is not accidental, it is systemic. Literacy in elite Roman households skewed male. Women of the upper classes left letters and occasional reflections, but matters they deemed private, sexual humiliation, ritual submission, rarely appear in family archives. When women appear, their narratives are mediated by male authors, legal records, or ecclesiastical polemic. The silence feels deliberate but is more precisely a symptom of whose testimony mattered. Public writing preserved public power. The experiences of women like Flavia Tertia disappeared into domestic space where memory was transmitted orally or not at all. That gap forces historians to rely on indirect clues, legal remedies women invoked, funerary inscriptions that emphasize maternal virtue, and occasional petitions where women complained to magistrates. These fragments tell a parallel story. Many women tried to work within the system, sometimes using the law to claim rights, sometimes accepting silence as survival. The gap in sources is itself evidence of the social order. We can enumerate cases where women appear in court records, asking for separation, contesting dowries, or seeking redress for mistreatment. Those records show that women were not mere objects. They could at times be litigants, yet the level of access necessary to pursue legal remedies, money, counsel, social support, was out of reach for many. Even when a woman pursued litigation, the cultural expectation of shame and discretion often muted her voice. The ritualized wedding night, therefore, functioned in a field where legal recourse existed in form but not always in practice. That reality made the ritual a durable instrument of social regulation. It operated where silence and structural limits reduced the likelihood of successful challenge. The Christian records that condemn the ritual are hostile but informative. Church fathers wrote with the purpose of discrediting pagan practices and converting the populace. Augustine, in his polemics, used the wedding night rites as examples of pagan corruption, insisting that such rites exposed the moral emptiness of old religion. Lactantius refused to name details, but treated the ritual as evidence of pagan depravity. Arnobius supplied explicit accusations to shock readers. Why use these sources? Because hostile witnesses often describe the practices they detest in detail, sufficient to reconstruct them. The Christian writers repurposed the details to argue for a new moral order that privileged privacy, chastity as internal virtue, and marriage as sacrament rather than property transaction. Their accounts are not neutral, but neither are they fabrications. The Christian polemicists conserved detail while reframing it into a narrative of moral progress. Church opposition was effective because it offered an alternative legal and moral vocabulary. Christian doctrine reframed marriage as a sacrament and emphasized modesty and privacy. Over time, the Christianized state sought to regulate marriage differently, prioritizing canonical consent and downplaying public verification rituals. When church authorities obtained power, they actively suppressed artifacts and texts that preserved pagan rites. Statues like Mutinus Tutinus were defaced or removed. Wall paintings and explicit imagery were whitewashed. Libraries purged texts that described obscene rites. This process of suppression worked with administrative measures. Marriage law itself was reformed under Christian influence, recasting the meaning of consummation and limiting the role of public inspection. The result was a gradual cultural erasure of certain practices, leaving only fragments in polemical or medical sources. Archaeology corroborates textual fragments in one striking way. Objects and spaces show traces of ritualized sex and rites of passage. Reliefs, wall paintings, and small votive offerings reveal an acceptance, or at least a tolerance, of obscene symbolism in the domestic and public spheres. Excavations in urban houses show spaces consistent with semi-public observations. Domestic rooms with beds oriented to be visible from the entrance conform to descriptions of marriage chambers and texts. Plaster and pigment traces suggest scenes were deliberately hidden or exposed depending on social function. Archaeology cannot prove how the rites were performed, but it aligns with written sources in demonstrating that sexual iconography was public and ritualized rather than entirely private. The material record confirms a social environment where fertility symbols, obscene reliefs, and ritual paraphernalia were ordinary elements of everyday life. Beyond iconography, inscriptions reveal the names of pronobae, household officials, and freedmen involved in ceremonial roles. Funerary inscriptions commemorate women for their matronal virtues. That epigraphic record confirms both public celebration of feminine domestic function and the social reward for conformity. In provinces, local variants of Roman ritual emerge in epigraphy and art. In North Africa, Etruria, and the eastern provinces, we find votive objects combining local fertility cults with Roman forms. These regional variations show that while the core logic of verification was Roman, actual practice adapted to local customs. This adaptability helped the system endure where it served local elites' interest in controlling lineage. Some historians attempt to minimize the ritual, arguing that descriptions exaggerate or misinterpret symbolic gestures. They propose that the bride might have sat briefly on a statue in a gesture of dedication, rather than in an act resembling intercourse. This interpretation draws on the idea that religious rituals are often symbolic and not literal. The counter-argument made by historians relying on medical and legal records insists the language in sources, insidia, mount, testify, points to a physical act significant enough to be measured by physicians. The debate matters because it changes how we think about the boundary between symbolic ritual and coercive physical practice. To resolve it, scholars weigh the testimony across genres: medical, juridical, religious, and archaeological. The balance of evidence leans toward a practice that was more than a brief seat. Whether that practice always included penetration or always resembled intercourse is harder to prove. The certainty is that the ritual involved intentional, physical engagement designed to produce observable change. Legal cases help clarify ambiguity. Disputes in which husbands allege non-consummation, or in which families contested a bride's prior loss of virginity, reveal the stakes. When jurists discuss annulment, they cite both physical evidence and witness testimony. No single source provides a complete picture, but the institutional insistence on observable consummation implies practices that went beyond symbolic contact. The ritual's aim was juridical certainty, where symbolic acts would not convince a jury or a magistrate. More forceful measures were used. That legal pragmatism explains why medical examinations were part of the sequence. The system prioritized results that could be recorded and recounted in court. The ritual's effect on women was variable. Some brides might have accepted the rite with resignation, others with fear, and a few might have experienced pleasure or relief in the married state. The lack of direct testimony prevents generalization, but the social structures conditioning marriage suggest many women endured the ritual under pressure. Survival strategies are visible in private letters and petitions where women appeal to male relatives, magistrates, or patrons. A woman could sometimes use the same legal structures to protect herself, claiming assault or demanding divorce, but those options had social costs. Women weighed the potential benefits of securing a household and children against the cost of public complaint. The ritual itself became a test of endurance and compliance. Those who resisted risked ostracism and economic precarity. For husbands, the ritual was a burden of proof as much as it was entitlement. A man like Marcus Petronius Rufus had a vested interest in securing heirs. He relied on a system that converted his daughter's transfer and his investment into documented offspring. The ritual formalized his property claim. It was a civic assurance that sealed inheritance lines. Men understood the ritual's logic pragmatically. Without clear proof, disputes could arise that threatened estates. That pragmatic view often conflicted with the private emotional dynamics of marriage. Husbands might feel embarrassment or reluctance. Some may have desired privacy, yet custom and law shaped action. The ritual taught both men and women a script. The public proof of consummation matters more than private feeling. Over generations, that lesson became cultural muscle, hard to resist even when conscience tugged otherwise. The transition to Christian legal and moral frameworks was uneven but decisive. Christian leaders campaigned against certain rites while absorbing others. The pronuba was retained but repurposed. The role became less about forensic verification and more about ceremonial mediation. Canon law emphasized consent and inner piety. The Church began to regulate who could marry whom, prohibitions about incestuous unions, and the canonical procedures for marriage. Over time, Christian communities insisted that marriage be preceded by bans, attempts at pastoral counseling, and later by the sacramental recognition. The dramatic change was not immediate, nor was it uniform across the empire, but by the late antique period the old forms of public sexual verification had lost official support. Imperial law increasingly echoed Christian sensibilities, and judges and magistrates adopted new standards. The suppression of certain practices was both legal and cultural. Temples were closed, priests converted, statues defaced. The Christian transformation had consequences beyond the courtroom. It altered how people remembered their past. Pagan rituals became scandalous anecdotes in sermons rather than living practices. The new moral grammar made the old customs embarrassing, and erasure followed. Texts that discussed erotic rites were judged dangerous and destroyed. The ideological reshaping of memory meant that later centuries would reconstruct Roman weddings through anachronistic lenses. The idea of the saffron veil and the ritual scattering of nuts became sanitized tokens of a distant past, replacing the more invasive reality of verification. The Christian revision of marriage was selective. It kept the institution but recoded its meaning. The legal codifications of the medieval and later Christian era further obscured ancient practices. Justinian's codices, the later Byzantine law, and the growing corpus of canon law reshaped how consummation and marriage were discussed. Where Roman jurists had treated consummation as a fact to be proven in civil law, Christian legal traditions infused it with sacramental weight. The notion of privacy became more pronounced in legal thought. Certain acts were considered too intimate to be public testimony. Medical testimony retained some role, but increasingly the Church preferred moral testimony about consent. The cumulative effect reduced the official place of rituals like mutinous tutinous. Over centuries, the memory of those practices faded into footnotes and hostile condemnations located in polemical texts. What scholars reconstruct today is the residue of a long process of forgetting. Forgetting was active as well as passive. Scribes copied Christian texts preferentially. Libraries housed hagiography and theology rather than manuals of ritual. Statues were repurposed or destroyed. Public spaces were reordered. The new order did not eliminate all traces. Graffiti, pottery, and stubborn votives survived in ground stratigraphy. Yet the dominant story changed. Where earlier Rome might have treated a bride's wedding night as legal proof, later societies described marriage as inward and sacred. The erasure was ideological and practical. By the time medieval and early modern writers looked back, they often misread or politely omitted details that would have made later readers uncomfortable. Modern scholarship must therefore work from fragments and inference. Historians cross-check juristic texts, ecclesiastical polemics, medical manuals, and archaeological data. The method is comparative and cautious. Each source contributes a piece of a larger puzzle. When Augustine writes with moral outrage, and a midwife manual supplies technical detail, the historian must weigh bias and corroboration. The result is a reconstruction that is stronger than any single evidence thread. Modern historians like Jane Gardner, Judith Evans Grubbs, and scholars of Roman law have pieced together practices of matrimony, revealing the institutional logic that made such rituals possible. Their work shows that what seems monstrous today was an outcome of a system in which property, piety, and patriarchy converged. The reconstructed picture is not tidy, but it is consistent enough to merit telling. This documentary is an exercise in that reconstruction. We proceed with caution about specifics while remaining firm on structural claims. Roman marriage frequently included acts meant to prove consummation and virginity. These acts operated as legal and religious verifications. Witnesses, physicians, and ritual officials were instrumental. The coercive effect on women was real, even where some women exercised agency within the system. These conclusions are not theoretical extrapolations, but grounded in sources that cross genres and span centuries. The goal is not to sensationalize, but to account for how institutions shape private life. The wedding night ritual matters because it reveals how law and religion can normalize invasions of privacy under the guise of civic necessity. Individual stories, when recoverable, illuminate the larger structure. Inscriptions from Pompeii and other sites include formulaic references to matronae, praised for fertility and domestic success. Legal petitions preserved in papyri from Egypt record complaints about dowry abuse and marital mistreatment. One rare text describes a legal dispute in which a husband claimed non-consummation. The document shows the kinds of testimony jurists expected: a physician's note, witness depositions, and procedural forms. These texts show the ritual in action. It is a mixture of the mundane and the juridical. Women appealed to patrons, husbands mobilized kin, magistrates mediated. The ritual thus functioned within a network of social ties that could sometimes, imperfectly, be used to protect the vulnerable. Even in such a system, outcomes were uneven and often favored men and property interests. The archival snapshots do not provide emotional detail, but they provide movement. They show negotiation, petitioning, and the slow accrual of legal documents that defined family life. A bride like Flavia Tertia emerges as a historical subject in such texts only as a social role: daughter, bride, mother, matron. The absence of her interior voice persists, yet the arch of her life, marriage, childbirth, household management, begins to show through the traces left by law and epitaph. The historian's sympathy is to watch how institutions shaped that arc, and how women navigated within constraints. The wedding night is one pivotal moment among many, where the power of law intervenes directly in the body and the household. There is an uncomfortable modern resonance to these rituals. Discussions about consent, bodily autonomy, and the legal regulation of sex have modern analogues. In contemporary law, the idea that private acts can be converted into evidence persists under certain conditions, for paternity, for criminal accusations, and for immigration claims. The Roman example forces a comparative reflection. When do legal systems privilege property and lineage over bodily autonomy? How do institutions arrange testimony and expertise to produce desired legal outcomes? These questions are not merely historical, they are part of an ongoing conversation about how law treats bodies, and how cultural norms shape what is considered admissible evidence. Using the Roman case as a lens does not aim to moralize modern institutions, but to show roots and continuities. Legal cultures evolve slowly, and practices that place evidence above consent can have long afterlives. The Roman wedding night ritual has no direct modern equivalent in most legal systems, but its logic, verification of private life by public authority, survives in different forms. Recognizing this continuity furnishes a cautionary lesson. Legal systems that treat bodies as data to be produced for property or status claims risk normalizing intrusive practices. Understanding the historical mechanisms that enabled such normalization helps us identify and resist them today. Beyond the law, the ritual shaped cultural attitudes towards sex and shame. Public songs, fescennine verses, had a role in the wedding procession, and their obscene humour prepared the community for the transition from maidenhood to married life. Those songs, often crude and ribald, functioned as social lubricant, removing the edge of mystery by turning it into communal jest. Yet the laughter was double-edged. It both normalised humiliation and diffused personal responsibility. Mothers, who sometimes wept in private, publicly arranged their daughter's hair and instructed her on the painful compromises to come. The public celebration and private distress coexisted as ordinary features of Roman life. The ritual, therefore, did not stand apart from the rest of culture, but integrated into festivals, family relations, and popular expression. The function of public mockery is telling. It socialized the bride into a role where her body was publicly focused yet privately disempowered. The songs and chants acted as communal validation for a practice that institutionalized control over women's sexuality. They also created shared cultural meaning, making the ritual feel less exceptional to participants and observers. The combination of laughter, ceremonial form, and legal procedure made the wedding night both spectacle and administrative act. That duality is central to understanding how social institutions mask coercion in routinized forms. The process of remembering and forgetting has contemporary scholarly implications. By the time Renaissance and Enlightenment writers revived interest in Rome, many of these intimate rites had been sublimated into sanitized accounts. Antiquarians found erotic objects but often reinterpreted them as mere curiosities. The modern scholarly endeavour to unearth the full nature of Roman wedding practices required a willingness to read across embarrassing evidence and hostile accounts. It involved acknowledging the uncomfortable, that a foundation of Western law included practices today recognized as abusive. Scholars faced resistance. For many, the image of Rome as the cradle of law and civilization did not easily accommodate the detail of ritual sexual verification. The resistance speaks to how cultural memory shapes scholarly attention. Easier narratives, emphasizing legal triumph and civic order, obscure friction and cruelty. Recovering suppressed practices is both an intellectual and ethical task. It challenges privilege, questions inherited narratives, and restores complexity to historical actors' lives. This documentary therefore aims to insist on complexity. It rejects simplistic legends about ancient weddings, and instead reconstructs a system where law, ritual, medicine, and family converge to govern one of the most private acts of life. There are fragments that persist unexpectedly: a lintel bearing a carved obscene figure, a papyrus recording a dowry dispute, a bishop's sermon offering righteous anger at pagan depravity. These fragments, each tiny and partial, resist total erasure. They allow us to see the contours of a social order that once took for granted practices abhorrent to modern sensibilities. Flavia Tertia's life, marriage, motherhood, household management, was ordinary for her time. Her wedding night was the ordinary legal procedure by which her social role was secured. Her silence was ordinary too. That ordinariness is the hardest fact to reckon with. Institutionalized invasion becomes normalized precisely because it is routine. The final fact is stark. Rome's legal and religious systems produced procedures that turned women's bodies into instruments of verification for property and lineage. Over centuries, a Christian moral order suppressed many of the explicit rituals, replacing them with a sanitized public memory. The women who lived through those nights, Flavia Tertia among them, left little testimony. Their experience is a gap in the archive, a negative space that nevertheless shapes the law and culture their descendants inherited. To remember them honestly is to hold together two truths. Rome produced legal sophistication and civic institutions that shaped Western law, and those institutions depended at times on systematic invasions of privacy that subordinated women to public verification. That double legacy complicates reverence and demands sober acknowledgement. Silent for millennia, the ritual returns in the fragments and in the quiet historical work of recovering the lives of those who endured it. The last sound is not triumphant but factual. The history stands stripped of myth, and the proper response is not exoneration but recognition of what was done and to whom.